The woman they called Ruth had once answered to another name, one branded in iron, whispered in the hollows of night. That name had been taken from her the way her child was taken, quick and cruel, with no promise of return. In 1867, 2 years after the war was declared over, the war within her had only just begun. Her skin bore the evidence of old chains, but her stride no longer faltered. She lived in the southern edge of Arkansas, where swamps curled like dark tongues and men still believed the old world had only paused, not ended. Ruth worked under no one now. She cleaned the church on Wednesdays, traded garden roots for soap or sewing needles, and spoke little. But she watched everything. She knew when the Reeves boy started running with old bushwhackers, knew which preacher's wife sold secrets for coin, and most of all, she knew the rhythm of her baby's breath. Elijah was only 10 months old, round-headed and solemn-eyed, always quiet in her arms. She nursed him in the late dusk, whispering stories in Gullah, the language her mother had refused to forget. She told him about salt marshes and sea spirits, about the red clay of Georgia and the cotton that bled men dry. But her stories always ended the same way, with her walking free and him walking further. It happened on a Sunday. 3 men came while the congregation sang louder than necessary, as if noise could ward off guilt. The sun glared down, and the fields steamed from last night's rain. Ruth was hanging linens behind her cabin when the door creaked open. She saw the tracks later, 2 boots, one limping. Elijah was gone before the second hymn. She screamed once, sharp enough to make the birds rise in spirals. Then she went quiet, hands trembling against the frame of the empty cradle. A button from his nightshirt had come loose and lay half buried in the floorboards. She tucked it into her cheek like a bone. Sheriff Clanton scratched his ear when she came to him. Probably wandered, he said, though the baby could barely crawl. Could be a bobcat or Choctaw gone raiding. She didn't blink. You think I'm a fool, sir. His eyes narrowed, but she was already turning. She returned to her cabin and packed what little she had, a hatchet, a jar of lard, salt, 2 hard biscuits wrapped in a cloth. She put on a wool coat that had once belonged to a Union soldier and tucked her only photograph of Elijah beneath her breast. The white preacher's wife tried to stop her. "You can't go alone, Ruth," she whispered. "This land isn't safe for women, especially not." "Then don't follow," Ruth said. She walked north that night under a sky stripped bare of stars. Her boots were too large, but she wore them anyway. Each step was a prayer without mercy. By the second day, she had learned the names of her pain. Hunger gnawed like fire ants behind her ribs. The silence hurt worse. She missed the weight of Elijah's body against her spine, missed his breath tickling her collar. A blacksmith in Little Rock saw her asking after a blond man with a broken gait and told her, low-voiced, that a child had been sold the week before. "White feller in a coat with brass buttons," he said, "rode out with a baby in a grain sack. Southbound, said he was taking it to his sister in Texas." "Was the child screaming?" she asked. He frowned, no, just staring, like he knew not to cry. She thanked him with half her water and slept that night beneath an overturned wagon. Rain came around midnight, cold and hard, and she let it soak her through, let it take what softness remained. 3 more days passed. She followed whispers, barterers in dry counties, a gambler who remembered a man flashing gold teeth and calling his sack God's mercy. In Texas, the law bent according to the pocket that held it. Ruth crossed the state line in a farmer's cart and traded the last of her lard for a place to ride. "Why do you want that child so bad?" the farmer asked, chewing a stem. Ruth stared ahead. "Because he's mine." The farmer said nothing else. She reached Denton by dusk and was met with a desert wind and a silence that burned. She learned from a laundress there that a boy child had been brought to the judge's sister 2 weeks prior. "Claims she's taking care of orphans," the woman muttered, "but every child she gets looks more like they was taken than given." That night Ruth stood outside the house, a big white one with a gate like a mouth, and waited. She watched candles flicker in windows too clean. She saw a figure pass by carrying something small. Her fingers curled around her hatchet, but she didn't rush. Revenge was not a fire, it was a wheel. She slept in the weeds beside the gate, heart pounding like a drum. In the morning, she would go in. And she would not leave alone. At dawn, Ruth stepped out of the weeds and walked straight to the gate. The iron creaked when she pushed it open, slow and steady, as if she belonged there. No one saw her enter, or if they did, they looked away. The house stood 3 stories tall, washed in pale yellow, trimmed in white. A porch circled its frame like a noose. Ruth climbed the steps, boots thick with mud, and knocked once. A Negro girl opened the door. Younger than Ruth, maybe 16, her eyes twitched when they met. She stepped aside without a word. Ruth entered. The parlor smelled of rosewater and meat. Lace curtains, over-polished furniture, walls cluttered with paintings of men who'd owned men. She stood in that room like she was made of something heavier than flesh. The girl spoke in a whisper. She keeps them upstairs, says they ain't ready for company. How many? 3 now, 2 boys, 1 girl, but the new one, he don't cry, just watches. Ruth's throat tightened. Where's the staircase? The girl pointed. Ruth moved without sound, passing through the air like a shadow grown long. At the top of the stairs, she heard it, breathing, thin and careful. She opened the second door on the left. Elijah sat in the center of a nursery painted blue. His cheeks were hollowed, arms thinner than she remembered, but the moment their eyes met, something uncoiled between them. No noise passed his lips. He blinked once, then held out his hand. She crossed the room in 4 steps, dropping to her knees. She pressed her face into his chest and trembled as she felt his fingers curl into her collar. She whispered nothing, only held him until he made a sound like wind touching leaves. Footsteps behind her. A woman stood in the doorway, face pinched and powdered. She wore a corset too tight for breathing and a pistol tucked into her waistband like it was part of her spine. "I suppose you're the mother," she said flatly. Ruth stood, child still clutched tight. "He was taken from me." "Don't mean he's yours. Law says otherwise." "I didn't ask the law." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You're not leaving." Ruth stepped forward. "Try and stop me." The gun came up slow. She was practiced but too proud. Ruth swung her hatchet once, clean and quick. The woman crumpled with a cry like glass shattering. The pistol clattered down the stairs. She didn't check if the woman was dead. She didn't need to. She carried Elijah down the staircase, boots leaving wet smears. The girl at the door stepped aside again, eyes wide. Ruth paused. "Go before someone blames you." "I ain't staying," the girl whispered. They slipped into the alley behind the house, ducking into the street just as the town began to stir. A dog barked once. A rooster screamed. By noon, there were notices nailed to every fence. A black woman with a stolen child, armed and dangerous. They slept in a haystack behind a Baptist church, wrapped in horse blankets. Ruth cut her hair with her knife, let it fall in clumps beside them. She rubbed soot on her skin, darkening it further. She traded her coat to a tinker for a worn shawl and made Elijah a sling from flour sack cloth. They moved by night. In a town near Gainesville, she heard of riders sent after her, white men who worked for coin, not justice. She changed direction, turned east instead of north, crossed dry country where snakes ruled the trails. Once Elijah whimpered from thirst, and she dug with her bare hands until brackish water rose up. Another time, a family of freedmen took them in for 3 days, fed them sweet potatoes and eggs, let Ruth wash the boy in warm water. She cried for the first time then, silent and fierce. "He's still yours," the old woman told her. "Even after all that's happened, he still knows you." She kissed Elijah's forehead that night and swore to herself that no man would touch him again, not while her hands still held strength. But danger caught up. In Mississippi, a bounty hunter cornered them in a feed store. He wore a badge, but it was chipped and rusted, more for show than law. "Come quiet," he said. "Won't hurt the boy if you behave." Ruth didn't answer. She handed Elijah to a boy near the flour sacks and told him, "Run to the back, don't stop." Then she turned and lunged. The fight was quick, brutal. She broke his nose with the heel of her hand, took 2 punches to the ribs, bit his ear until it tore. He stabbed her in the shoulder, but she kept swinging. She found a hammer and crushed his knee with it. He didn't rise after that. She limped for 3 days, fevered, half-blind. Elijah never left her side. When they reached the border of Alabama, she knew she couldn't keep running. So she started looking for allies. She found a preacher named Harlan who ran a sanctuary for colored families. He fought in the Union, lost 2 sons, and believed in debts owed. He took them in, stitched her wound with fishing twine, gave Elijah milk. "You want safety," he said. "You stay." "I want justice," she replied. "I stay until I get it." He nodded once. She slept that night under a roof with no lakes, in a bed that did not creak with ghosts. In the morning, she asked for paper and ink. She began writing names, not just the woman in Denton, but the men who allowed her to take the child, the sheriff who ignored her, the preacher who stayed silent, the gambler who gave false directions. Each one would pay. But first she would build something, a fire maybe, or a trial. Not in a court, in the open, where all could see. Word traveled faster than horses in those days. People said a woman had cut through 3 states like a knife through pork belly, said she carried a child on her back and death in her hands. In Selma, men gathered in parlors and porches whispering of her with equal parts fear and awe. One man claimed she was a conjure woman, risen from the swamp. Another swore he'd seen her ride past with blood in her eyes and a hatchet at her hip. They called her the Dark Rider, the baby thief, the Devil's Mother. Ruth said nothing to any of it. In Harlan's church house, which had once been a mule barn, she taught herself to read by candlelight. Letters came slowly, but she knew how to listen, how to repeat, how to remember. She traced every word with the same precision she once used to dig graves for the others back on the rice fields. Harlan's niece, a girl named Lottie with scars like a whip had danced over her back, helped Ruth write the rest of the names. The men who bought children like hogs, the women who dressed stolen babies in ribbons and told themselves they were saving them, the riders who scouted for orphans and came back with bruises on their knuckles. Ruth didn't believe in forgiveness. She believed in return. By autumn, she had a list of 17 names. She folded it into her coat like a second spine. She gathered charcoal for fire, wire for snares, coins from sewing seams for the freedmen who couldn't afford tailors' prices. And she waited for the first one to show himself. He came on a mule with one bad leg and a scar beneath his eye. She knew the scar. It had been there when he tore a child from a mother's breast in the night. He'd been one of the overseers in Louisiana, said the war had ruined him. He hadn't changed. Ruth let him drink from the well, let him ask where she was headed. Then she asked if he remembered a girl with broken fingers and teeth knocked out by the butt of a musket. He stared too long. Recognition was slow but sure. She struck him behind the ear with a brick and dragged his body to the woods. He woke up tied to a cypress root, flies already licking his lips. "You know who I am," she said. He sobbed something about the war, about orders, about survival. She drove the hatchet into his thigh and left him bleeding, not enough to die, just enough to be found crawling. She left a note pinned to his coat. She remembers. 2 days later, she burned a plantation house that had turned into an orphan trading post. No children were inside. She had made sure of that. She took 3 babies out before she lit the flame, handed them to women too stunned to ask questions. "You keep them close," she said. "Don't let no one name them but you." She left again before dawn. The preacher stopped trying to change her mind. "You want war," he said. "I was born in it." More names fell. The gambler who lied to her was found hanging from a tree with a deck of cards shoved into his mouth. The bark was carved with the initials E.H., Elijah's. In Georgia, a woman woke to find her fine dresses shredded, her nursery painted with blood. Not from children, but chickens, enough to stain the wood for years. "You're scaring people," Harlan warned. "I aim to." But Ruth wasn't reckless. She chose carefully. Only those who'd touched her boy or trafficked others like him. She knew the difference between vengeance and madness. Elijah grew quiet but strong. He watched her with an old man's gaze. He'd seen death already, had heard the scrape of blades, the silence after fire. At 5, he could tie knots and start a fire. At 6, he shot his first squirrel. One night he asked her, "Why do they hate us?" She didn't lie, because they see what they did. When they look at us, they see what they can't hide. They moved again, this time into Tennessee, where the hills rolled thick with fog and poverty. Ruth found work clearing stones from a freedman's cemetery, used the coin to buy gunpowder and teach Elijah how to load shells. In a tavern near Memphis, a man offered to buy her drink. She ignored him. He spat and called her uppity. She followed him out, broke his jaw with a fence post, didn't kill him, just made sure he'd think twice before lifting his mouth against a woman. By now, the bounty on her was real. $500 for the woman with a child and a hatchet, alive preferred. But no one could say where she'd be next. She was wind, shadow, vengeance clothed in flesh. And still, the list wasn't done. In the winter of 1870, she returned to Arkansas. She hadn't meant to, but something pulled her, unfinished threads maybe, or the face of the sheriff who'd smiled as he said, probably wandered. She came back cloaked, hair grayed with ash, Elijah walking beside her like a younger brother. They entered the town at dusk. The sheriff still wore the same belt buckle, still carried the same rifle. He didn't recognize her. She watched him for 2 days, saw him take bribes, spit tobacco into the street, slap a black boy for walking too fast. Then she stepped into his office. He squinted. "Can I help you?" "You can kneel." The gunshot rang through the town square. He crawled. She didn't stop him. She handed Elijah the hatchet. "Cut the badge off," she said. Elijah did, hands steady. They left the town in silence. No one followed. But the name Ruth began to grow heavy again. Not in fear, in reverence. She wasn't just a mother now. She was a reckoning. And her child walked behind her, bearing witness. They passed through the edge of Mississippi under cloud-thick skies, where the sun bled pale through fog, and every road felt like a question she'd already answered. Ruth no longer ran. She moved with purpose, not fear. Each mile marked another name stripped from her list. Each fire lit behind her a message left for those still hiding behind paper laws and godless money. Elijah grew into his limbs. He no longer clung when men approached. He watched their hands first, then their eyes. He spoke little but remembered every direction, every creek crossing, every face of the ones who tried to smile kindly but never looked at his mother straight. In the town of Claiborne, she found the woman who had bought Elijah's name. Mrs. Davern had called herself a savior in letters sent to Northern sponsors. Said she took freed babies into her care, taught them to read, dressed them in lace. What she did not write about were the hunger belts, the locked cellars, the way she cut their names short to fit better on church rolls. Ruth entered the woman's schoolhouse with Elijah at her side, coat tight around her body, boots caked in dust. Children sat on benches, hands folded, eyes wide. The teacher stuttered, "Are you?" Ruth raised her hand, "Quiet." The children obeyed faster than any whip could command. Mrs. Davern stepped out from the back room, powdered and smiling like a cracked porcelain doll. "You must be lost, dear." "I'm not," Ruth said. The woman's smile stiffened. "This is a school, not a shelter." Ruth unpinned a yellowed paper from her coat. "Is this your name?" The woman reached for it. Ruth let it drop. "This paper says you bought my child, paid a man $3 and a bottle of corn liquor. You called it charity. I gave him a home. You gave him a room with no window. I was protecting him. You gave him your name." The silence that followed stretched too long. Ruth leaned down to Elijah and said, "Show her yours." He stepped forward and pulled the old photograph from his shirt. Ruth and Elijah, taken when he was still swaddled in cotton, a scar from the hearth behind them, the same scar that marked Ruth's arm. The woman paled. "You don't belong here," she said. "You're right," Ruth replied, "but I came anyway." She didn't kill her, she didn't need to. She took the school's ledger, took the ink from the well, took every child's name back and read them aloud until they sounded real again. Then she walked out and set fire to the garden instead of the house. So the roots would never grow the same. Elijah helped her plant new ones the next day in a different town. Children followed them now, not many, just 3. The ones Ruth had freed from cellars and cages. She let them choose their own names. She taught them to carry blades in their boots, to walk like nothing could surprise them, to speak only when speaking meant something. The law came once, with shackles and a list. Ruth met them in the street, Elijah at her shoulder, her hands empty. "You'll hang," the marshal said. "You'll bleed," she replied. They didn't arrest her, not because they couldn't, but because every man behind the marshal knew his name could be on her list next. She didn't wear a badge, she didn't raise an army. But people started sending her letters, some with names, some with cries for help. She burned the ones that smelled of guilt. She answered the rest in person. In Tennessee, she stood at the gallows and cut the rope before a boy could swing. The sheriff stepped forward. She aimed a musket at his thigh. "He stole bread," she said. "You'd hang a child for hunger." "He's colored. So's the sun when it rises. That do mean it's yours to smother." She dragged the boy down. He ran. She walked. By the time spring returned, she had a trail of stories behind her. None told right, but none forgotten. In Alabama, she found the last man on her original list. A trader named Alton Keyes, red hair, broken fingers from too many card games, known for laughing when he took babies in exchange for debt forgiveness. He lived fat in a mansion built from cotton ghosts. She entered his land at dusk. No disguise, no fear. He opened the door himself. "Ma'am, you remember Louisiana." He squinted. "Plenty been there." "You remember the campfires at night, when babies cried and you said they sounded like dogs." His face twisted. "Wait." She hit him with the butt of her rifle, took his teeth out with one swing. He died slowly. She didn't watch. She let Elijah light the fire in the hearth with the man's deeds. That night she crossed his name out in silence. Then she tore the list in half. Because revenge had kept her alive, but Elijah needed more than that now. He needed land. So she found it. Near a river bend in Georgia, she claimed a parcel no one dared live on, said to be cursed. Soil red as flesh, trees gnarled like arthritic hands. She cut them down one by one, built a cabin with a chimney tall enough to carry sorrow out like smoke. The children stayed, more came. She taught them to shoot, to plant, to write, to speak, to carry their own stories like fire in their fists. And every year, on the day Elijah had been taken, she sat beneath the oldest tree and carved one more notch. Not for grief. For survival. Because they took her baby once. And she rode across states, bled in barns, lit fires in the hearts of cowards, until there was no taking him again. Now he stood beside her, taller, stronger, quiet as the storm before rain. And he called her mother. Not because of blood, but because she had chosen not to break. The air over the land she claimed turned sweet in the spring, thick with pine sap and promise. The red soil no longer bled. It bore fruit, okra, beans, sweet corn in rows like prayers. They built more cabins. Elijah raised the first frame with his own hands, splinters biting his palms. He did not flinch. He never had. They named the place Hollow Bend, not because it was empty, but because it had once echoed with ghosts. Now it echoed with voices, black children laughing, black mothers singing, black men building with tools no one else had ever given them. No one came to take any more. Not here. But Ruth knew peace wasn't a gift. It was a boundary kept by fire and reputation. She did not let herself soften, not in the way people begged her to. She still kept her hatchet beneath the hearth, wrapped in leather and prayer, still checked the tree line each morning, still walked with her shoulders square and back straight, because that was how you held a past like hers. Upright. Word of Hollow Bend spread through the South. Folks whispered of a settlement that took in the stolen, that buried the broken, that raised up children with no past and gave them names that meant something. Not names from masters, nor from white Bibles, but from mothers who carved them out of mud and memory. White men came sometimes, a preacher, a merchant, 2 men with warrants folded in their boots. They always left quiet, some limped, one never left at all. Ruth never spoke of it. She kept records, though, bound in a ledger Elijah carved from oak bark and stitched with string pulled from the hem of her oldest coat. Every child they took in, she wrote their name, what they remembered, what they feared. It became a book of shadows turned flesh. She never wrote her own name. Not the one she'd been born with, not the one she'd been branded by, only what she had chosen, Ruth, mercy not given but made. Years passed like trains in the distance, heavy, relentless. Sometimes she thought she heard them in her dreams, iron clanking, wheels grinding over track, but she always woke to wind in the trees and the smell of ash from the morning stove. Elijah grew tall and quiet. He spoke only when he had something to say, but when he did, men listened. He became the voice of Hollow Bend, the weight-bearer, the one who could walk into a white town and return unscathed, not because they loved him, but because they feared what stood behind him. One summer he brought home a girl with gold eyes and hands calloused from spinning thread. Ruth said little, just watched the way he looked at her. She approved when she saw the girl skin a rabbit without blinking. They were wed beneath the cypress tree where Ruth had buried her last list. There was no preacher, no rings, just fire and silence and the sound of hands finding hands. In time, Ruth became less bone and more shadow. Her joints stiffened, her eyes dimmed, but her mind stayed sharp, wedded on decades of memory. She no longer rode, no longer hunted, but she trained the next girls to do it. Hard-eyed daughters of Hollow Bend, girls who remembered the names of their mothers, girls who didn't flinch at screams. She taught them how to watch a man's walk and know if he lied, how to bury blood deep, how to stitch wounds in the dark with thread held between their teeth. They called her mother Ruth, and later just mother. No one else needed the word. One winter the river flooded and washed away the eastern cabins. A boy drowned. Ruth buried him herself. Elijah wanted to help, but she shook her head. A mother puts her children down gently, she said, even into the earth. After that she didn't eat much, slept more, stared longer into the fire. Elijah sat by her one night while wind scratched the shutters. He watched her hand, now knotted with age, turn pages in the ledger. "You ready?" he asked. She didn't look at him. "Don't ask foolish things." He nodded. He never asked again. Spring came late that year. The land turned stubborn, but when it broke, it bloomed harder than before. Ruth walked the border of Hollow Bend one last time, tracing the line of what she'd built with fingertips worn smooth. She found the place where she'd first buried her anger, deep beneath the first cypress stump, and sat beside it. There, with the wind at her back and the ground solid beneath her, Ruth let the weight of her life settle. No tears, no final words, just breath slowing. She died as she had lived, watching. Elijah buried her in the roots of that tree, wrapped her in the same coat she'd once carried him in, said no sermon, only carved her name into the bark. Not Ruth, but she took them back, and beneath it in smaller hand. And she never gave them up again. The fire in Hollow Bend burned a little lower that year, but it did not die. Because Ruth had never taught them how to quit, only how to survive. And how to make survival into a story worth fearing.